You know, there's a sentence that can break a parent's heart in ways no betrayal or tragedy ever could. I heard it from my own son, the very boy I raised, the one I sacrificed decades of my life for. He looked me in the eye, and with a smirk that still haunts me, he said, "Dad, you're just an extra in our story." An extra. That's what I was reduced to after years of back-breaking work, sleepless nights, and countless sacrifices that were never about me. They were about him. Let me take you back to that moment, because to understand the sting of those words, you need to know who we were as a family. My name is Michael Hale. I wasn't born with privilege. My parents, God bless them, taught me the value of sweat and honesty. My father used to say, "A man's worth isn't in the words he speaks, but in the family he raises." I lived by that creed every single day. When my son Ethan Hale was born, I made a silent promise. This boy will never know hunger. He will never go without opportunity, and he will never feel the limitations that kept me from pursuing my own dreams. And so I worked, harder than I thought possible. Double shifts at the factory, weekend jobs fixing cars. I poured every dollar, every ounce of energy into making sure Ethan had doors open to him that had always been locked for me. He wasn't alone, of course. My wife, Linda, was my partner through it all. She was softer than me, kinder in ways I could never be, and she kept our home full of warmth even when the bills piled up. She adored Ethan. He was her pride and joy. We also had our daughter, Claire, Ethan's younger sister. She was quieter, more reserved, the kind of child who'd sit next to me on the porch just to keep me company while I unwound after long days. Ethan, though, he was the star, the golden boy. Teachers praised him. Coaches celebrated him. Relatives whispered about how bright his future was. I can't deny it, I loved seeing him shine. Every time someone told me, "You've raised a remarkable son," I felt my chest swell with pride. I thought my sacrifices were worth it. I paid for his private schooling, his college tuition, and when he wanted to marry young, I wrote the checks for the wedding. Later, when he and his wife wanted a home, I dug into my savings, the same savings I had built for my retirement, and I put the down payment on their first house. I gave, and I gave, and I gave, without once stopping to ask, "Does he even see what I'm doing? Does he care?" And then came the night. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, at least not at first. We were sitting in his new house, the one I had helped pay for. Linda was there, smiling proudly, and Claire sat quietly in the corner. Ethan was in his usual confident mood, talking about his plans, his life, his successes. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I said, "I'm just glad I could help you get here, son." He chuckled, not maliciously at first, but casually, almost dismissively. He looked at me, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Dad, you've got to understand, you're just an extra in our story now. We're the main characters. You've done your part." The room went silent. Linda tried to laugh it off, saying, "Oh, Ethan, don't say it like that." Claire lowered her gaze. Her eyes filled with something I'll never forget, pity. But me, I sat there frozen. Do you know what it feels like to have your entire life, the decades of work, sacrifice, and devotion, summed up as background noise in someone else's story? To be told that you no longer matter, that your role is finished, and that the very person you built your world around now sees you as disposable. In that moment, a part of me died. It wasn't the money. It was never about the money. It was the disrespect. It was the dismissal of my existence, the denial of my role in his life, the erasure of everything I had done. I wasn't a father in his eyes anymore. I was a prop, an extra. And as I sat there, replaying those words in my head, I made a quiet decision, one I didn't say out loud that night. I decided that if my son saw me as nothing more than an extra, then maybe it was time I stopped trying to be part of his story. But what he didn't know, what he wouldn't discover until decades later, is that extras sometimes have the power to change the ending. After that night when my son called me an extra, I couldn't stop replaying my life in my head. To understand why those words cut so deep, you need to know where I came from and what kind of man I tried to be. I grew up in a small town in Indiana. My parents were simple people. My father, George, worked at the steel mill, and my mother, Rose, cleaned houses for a living. We weren't poor, exactly, but every dollar was stretched until it screamed. I learned early that nothing came easy. My father used to come home with grease-stained hands and say, "Son, there's no shame in working yourself raw if it means your family eats well." Those words stuck to me like they were welded to my bones. When I became a father, I swore I'd carry that same grit. I didn't want my kids to know the kind of worry I had growing up, the kind where you wondered if the lights would stay on or if there'd be enough food in the fridge for the week. I wanted their childhoods to be filled with opportunity, not scarcity. So I worked. For decades, I worked. By the time my son Ethan was born, I was already pulling double shifts at the auto plant. On weekends, I fixed neighbors' cars in our driveway, grease staining my own hands just like my father's. Every extra dollar I tucked away, not for vacations or fancy things, but for the future, Ethan's future. My wife, Linda, was the gentle balance to my rough edges. Where I was strict and practical, she was nurturing and forgiving. She had a way of smoothing over the cracks I left in conversations, of making sure Ethan and his sister, Claire, always felt safe. I'll never forget how she used to place her hand on my shoulder after a long day and whisper, "You're building something, Michael. One day they'll understand." Ethan grew up in the glow of those sacrifices. He was sharp, charismatic, and ambitious from the start. Teachers would pull me aside at parent-teacher conferences and say things like, "That boy is going places," and I believed it. I wanted nothing more than to give him wings strong enough to carry him as far as his dreams would take him. When he was accepted into college, one of the best in the state, it felt like my entire life's purpose had been validated. The tuition bills were terrifying, but I didn't blink. I cashed out savings accounts, I took on side jobs, and I told myself, this is what fathers do. This is what I was born for. And I didn't stop there. When Ethan fell in love and decided to marry young, Linda and I poured our hearts and wallets into the wedding. It wasn't extravagant, but it was beautiful. I remember looking at him in his tuxedo thinking, I gave him this moment. Later, when he and his wife were ready to buy a house, I wrote the check for the down payment. I did it without hesitation because in my mind, that's what fathers were supposed to do. Keep giving, keep building, keep sacrificing. Meanwhile, our daughter Claire watched it all quietly. She wasn't bitter, though sometimes I wondered if she felt overlooked. She never asked for much, just time, just my attention. She'd sit with me on the porch after dinner, no words exchanged, just the two of us listening to the crickets. Sometimes she'd say softly, "Dad, you work too hard." And I'd chuckle, pat her hand, and tell her I was fine. But the truth was, I wasn't fine. By my late 40s, my body ached in ways it never had before. My hands, once strong and steady, started to stiffen from years of labor. My back screamed every morning when I bent down to tie my boots. And yet, every time I felt like slowing down, I thought of Ethan. I thought of his future, his children, his story. I imagined one day sitting with him as an old man, hearing him say, "Dad, I couldn't have done this without you." That dream kept me alive. And so, when Ethan finally settled into the house I helped him buy, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the time had come for me to step back, to enjoy the fruits of all those years of sacrifice. I thought I would finally hear the words every father longs for: appreciation, gratitude, respect. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that instead of gratitude, I was about to hear the cruelest words of my life. I used to think the hardest part of being a father was the labor, the long hours at the plant, the side jobs that left my hands cracked and raw, the exhaustion that came from years of never really resting. But I was wrong. The hardest part of being a father, I learned, is when the child you gave everything for looks at you like you don't matter. The night it happened didn't begin as anything unusual. It was a quiet Saturday. Linda had insisted we all gather at Ethan's new house for dinner. She loved moments like that. Family around the table, laughter in the air, the smell of food filling every corner of the home. I could tell she was proud of Ethan, proud that he was standing tall in the very house we had helped him buy. Claire was there too, seated quietly as always, smiling softly whenever her brother told stories. The table was beautiful. Ethan's wife, Megan, had cooked a roast with all the sides. They had decorated the dining room with pictures of their honeymoon, framed diplomas, and little knickknacks that made the place feel alive. I looked around and thought, I helped build this. I helped give him this life. And that thought filled me with a quiet pride. The conversation at dinner flowed easily at first. Ethan talked about his job, how his boss was already hinting at a promotion. He spoke of the future he was building, the vacations he wanted to take, the family he and Megan dreamed of starting. He had that same charisma he'd always had, the kind of presence that drew people in. Linda beamed as she listened. At some point, I leaned back in my chair and said, half to myself, I'm just glad I could help you get here, son. That's all a father really wants. It was meant to be a simple truth, a gentle acknowledgement of the years behind us. But Ethan looked at me with that grin, the confident, almost cocky smile he wore so naturally, and he chuckled. Not cruelly, not at first, but with a carelessness that stung. Dad, he said, shaking his head, you've got to understand something. You're just an extra in our story now. We're the main characters. You've done your part. The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples no one knew how to stop. I froze. At first, I thought maybe I misheard him. My ears rang, my chest tightened, and all I could do was stare. Linda's smile faltered, and she quickly tried to smooth it over. Oh, Ethan, don't say it like that. Your father's been everything to you. But Ethan only shrugged, as if he hadn't said anything out of line. He poured himself another glass of wine and kept talking about his plans, oblivious to the silence pressing down around us. I looked at Claire. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes were wide, filled with pity and something else I couldn't quite name. Anger, maybe. She looked at me like she wanted to say something, but she didn't. She just lowered her gaze and picked at the food on her plate. In that moment, my entire life played in my head like a cruel montage. The long nights at the factory, the blistered hands fixing cars in the cold, the tuition checks that drained my savings, the wedding I paid for so Ethan could stand tall in front of his friends and family, the house down payment that meant I'd have to delay my own retirement. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment I had chosen his dreams over my own. All of it collapsed into nothing under the weight of a single sentence. An extra in our story. Do you know what it feels like to be erased while you're still alive? To be told, not with anger, but with casual dismissal, that your role is finished, that you are no longer needed, no longer respected, no longer even seen. It felt like my soul had been quietly pushed out of the picture, like I had become invisible in the very life I built. I wanted to say something back. I wanted to slam my fist on the table, to shout, I am not an extra. I am the reason you're here. I am the man who gave you everything. But the words never came. Instead, I sat there, my chest heavy, my throat tight, my pride crumbling in silence. Linda reached under the table and placed her hand on mine, trying to steady me, but her touch couldn't erase what had been said. Claire looked at me again, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and I knew she understood. She was the only one who truly saw what those words had done. The dinner ended in awkward politeness, but nothing felt the same. I drove home that night with Linda beside me, chattering softly to fill the silence. I didn't respond much. I just kept hearing his voice, replaying those words until they were etched into my bones. That was the night I realized my son no longer saw me as his father. In his eyes, I had become background noise, a shadow, a forgotten character. And though I didn't say it out loud, I made a decision in that silence. If he thought I was just an extra, maybe it was time to stop trying to play the role of a main character in his life. That night at Ethan's house never left me. His words clung to me like a shadow, following me into every quiet corner of my life. You're just an extra in our story. At first, I thought maybe I was overreacting, that maybe Ethan had just been careless with his words. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized he had said exactly what he meant. And so, for the first time in my life as a father, I stopped. I didn't announce it. There wasn't some big confrontation where I told him I was done. No, I chose something quieter, something I knew would speak louder than any argument ever could. I began removing myself, bit by bit, day by day, from Ethan's world. At first, it was simple things. He called me about a car repair, and instead of driving across town to fix it, I gave him the number of a mechanic. When his anniversary came around, I didn't slip a check into his hand. When he hinted about help with a vacation fund, I smiled politely and said, "I'm sure you'll figure it out." Linda noticed right away. One night, while she was folding laundry, she looked at me with concern and asked, "Michael, why are you pulling? Back from Ethan? You've always been there for him." I remember staring at the shirt I was folding, taking my time before I answered. "He doesn't see me as part of his story anymore, Linda. Extras don't get invited to the main scenes." Her eyes softened, but there was sadness in them. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. He's young. He doesn't understand yet. But that was the problem. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a grown man, a husband, soon to be a father himself. If he didn't understand by now, maybe he never would. Claire, on the other hand, noticed my change but didn't question it right away. Instead, she spent more time with me. She'd stop by after work, bringing takeout or just sitting with me on the porch like she used to as a girl. One evening, she finally asked, "Dad, why don't you visit Ethan anymore?" I looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because he told me I'm an extra, sweetheart. Extras don't belong in the main story. They just fill the background." Her eyes welled with tears, and she whispered, "You've never been an extra to me." Those words meant more than she knew. They gave me a sense of quiet strength, a reassurance that not all my sacrifices had gone unnoticed. The weeks turned into months, and slowly my absence became normal. Ethan stopped asking for help, maybe because he realized I wasn't going to provide it anymore. He and I spoke less and less, our conversations shrinking to short pleasantries on holidays. Linda struggled with it. She'd beg me to come with her when she visited Ethan and Megan, but I often refused. I told her she was free to go, that she should spend as much time with them as she wanted, but I couldn't bring myself to sit at that table again, pretending his words hadn't carved me hollow. Instead, I poured my time into other things. I started repairing old furniture in the garage, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. Claire became my closest companion, helping me with projects, sharing quiet dinners, sometimes even dragging me to little art shows or community events. It wasn't revenge I was after. I wasn't punishing Ethan. I wasn't hoping he'd wake up one day and beg for forgiveness. No, it was simpler than that. I was reclaiming my dignity. For decades, I had given everything without asking for recognition. But being told I was an extra made me realize something. You can give and give until you've bled yourself dry, but if someone doesn't value your role, you owe it to yourself to stop. The hardest part wasn't the silence. It was watching Linda struggle. She didn't live long enough to see the full consequence of Ethan's words. Cancer took her a few years later, and on her deathbed she whispered, "Take care of both of them, Michael. They'll need you." I kissed her forehead, but inside I knew. I could no longer carry both. Ethan had made his choice, even if he didn't realize it at the time. Claire was the one who stayed, the one who understood, the one who never once made me feel like a background character. So I kept living quietly, fading further from Ethan's life with each passing year. He built his career, raised his children, celebrated his milestones, and I was barely more than a shadow on the edge of those moments. He never asked why I wasn't closer, never tried to bridge the gap. Maybe he thought extras didn't need to be included, but what he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that I had already made a different choice entirely. A choice that would only come to light decades later, when the story he thought he owned collided with the ending I had been writing all along. By the time I reached my 70s, my body was slowing down, but my mind was sharper than ever. Years of quiet reflection had given me clarity, and I knew exactly what I wanted to leave behind. Not just my possessions, not just the money I had managed to save, but a final message, a statement of worth that couldn't be ignored or dismissed with a careless chuckle. When I sat with the lawyer to draft my will, I was deliberate. Every word mattered. Every line was chosen with purpose. I didn't write it with bitterness, though. I wrote it with truth. I left the majority of my estate, my business, my home, my savings, to Claire. She had never asked me for a thing, but she had always given me her time, her presence, her quiet respect. Ethan, I left only a small portion, enough to acknowledge him as my son, but not enough to feed his sense of entitlement. The lawyer raised his eyebrows when he read my instructions. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Hale? This will cause some shock." I smiled and nodded. Yes, that's the point. Sometimes a man's worth has to be written in ink so it can't be erased. And with that, the stage was set for the moment I knew would one day come. When I passed away, the world went quiet for me, but I imagine the noise for Ethan began the moment he learned of the will reading. By then, he was 45. Life hadn't turned out as smooth as he once imagined. The promotions had slowed, the bills had grown, and he had started looking toward my estate as the cushion that would carry him through his midlife. I picture him walking into that lawyer's office, shoulders squared, expecting to finally reap the rewards of all I had built. Claire was already there, composed, her face steady, but her eyes unreadable. She had known about the will long before Ethan did. I trusted her with that knowledge, and she carried it with quiet dignity. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read. Formal words, legal jargon, all leading to the heart of it, the division of my estate. When he said Claire's name, attached to the words primary beneficiary, I imagine the silence that followed. Ethan must have blinked, thinking he misheard. He probably leaned forward, waiting for the correction. But the lawyer didn't pause. He continued reading, detailing the assets, my house, my savings, the business I had built with my own hands, all of it passing to my daughter. And then came the small section addressed to Ethan, enough to show that I hadn't forgotten him, enough to say he was still my son, but nothing more. Ethan's face, I'm told, went pale. His voice cracked as he interrupted the lawyer. "There must be some mistake. That's not possible. I'm his son." The lawyer adjusted his glasses and replied calmly, "Mr. Hale, your father was very clear in his wishes. This is not a mistake. He explained his reasoning in detail, and I am bound to honor it." Ethan must have looked at Claire then, desperate for an ally. But Claire didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply looked at him with the same steady calm she had always shown. Finally, she said, "Dad left me everything because I never treated him like an extra. You had his love, Ethan, but you never saw it. You never valued it." Those words must have struck harder than the will itself. For the first time, Ethan had to face the truth. He had dismissed me as background noise in his story, not realizing that I was the one who had built the stage he stood on. And now, in death, I had spoken in the only way left to me, with the finality of my choices. I imagine him sitting there, anger mixing with shame, regret clawing at his chest. The lawyer said he was quiet after that, staring at the papers in disbelief, his hands trembling. Claire placed her hand gently on the table and whispered, Dad loved you, Ethan. He really did. But love isn't endless when it's ignored. That was the moment, the climax of our story. The son, who once believed I was an extra, finally realized that the man he dismissed had been the author of the ending all along. And though I wasn't there to see it, I know the lesson was finally written across his heart. Respect is worth more than inheritance, and love, once discarded, cannot simply be cashed in when it's convenient. Death has a way of silencing the noise of everyday life. After I passed, the conversations shifted from birthdays and holidays to lawyers and paperwork. But within that silence, the choices I had made, the decisions written into my will, spoke louder than any words I could have uttered in life. For Claire, my daughter, the inheritance wasn't about money. She had always known the truth. I valued her because she valued me. When she learned she was the primary beneficiary, she wept, not from greed or triumph, but from a mixture of grief and gratitude. She later told a family friend, "Dad gave me more than his estate. He gave me his trust." For Ethan, though, the aftermath was something else entirely. He came to the house one final time, standing in the driveway where I had once taught him to ride a bike. Claire told me later that he didn't walk inside right away. He just stood there, staring, at the front porch, his eyes tracing the places where I had once sat, waiting for him to come home. When he finally entered, the walls were lined with memories. Family photographs, holiday decorations, little trophies from his childhood. He walked through each room in silence, as though the air itself carried the weight of what he had lost. He reached my workshop in the garage and saw the old tools neatly lined up, the smell of wood and oil lingering. On the workbench sat a note I had left behind. It wasn't long, just a single sentence written in my shaky handwriting. "Love is a gift, son. Once it's ignored, it can't be reclaimed." Claire said Ethan stood there for a long time, holding that note in his hands, his shoulders trembling. For the first time in decades, the arrogance was gone. What remained was a man realizing too late that respect, once withheld, can't be bought back with regret. The will caused friction, of course. Extended family whispered, some saying I had been too harsh, others quietly admitting they understood. But I hadn't acted out of spite. I had acted out of truth. My life's final chapter was about setting the record straight, that sacrifice deserves recognition, that love should never be taken for granted, and that silence does not mean weakness. Claire carried on my legacy with grace. She didn't flaunt her inheritance. She used part of it to restore the house, turning it into the kind of warm, welcoming place her mother would have loved. She set aside funds for her own children's education, honoring the same values I had lived by. In many ways, she became the proof that my sacrifices hadn't been wasted. Ethan, though, his path was harder. He tried to contest the will at first, but the lawyer's airtight preparation left no room for argument. Eventually, he stopped fighting. He withdrew, humiliated, ashamed, carrying the weight of his mistake like a stone in his chest. People say he's different now, quieter, less boastful, more reflective. But whether that change came too late, I'll never know. As for me, I take comfort in knowing that my story didn't end in bitterness. It ended in clarity. I had been dismissed as an extra, but in the end I proved something to myself, and to everyone who cared to see, that I was never an extra. I was the foundation, the builder, the man who quietly shaped a family's destiny. And that's the lesson I hope lingers beyond my story. Fathers, mothers, grandparents, anyone who gives everything of themselves to others, you are not extras. Your worth is not defined by whether someone acknowledges it in the moment. But when respect is missing, when love is taken for granted, you have every right to step back, to preserve your dignity, and to remind the world that sacrifices are not owed, they are given. If there's one message I could leave etched in stone, it's this: love is not endless when it's ignored. Show gratitude to the people who raised you, who sacrificed for you, who stood in the shadows so you could shine in the spotlight. Because one day, when the shadows are gone, you might realize too late that they were holding the light all along. So, I'll leave you with the question I wish Ethan had asked himself sooner. If the people who sacrificed for you disappeared tomorrow, would you regret how you treated them today? That's not just my story. That's a truth every family should carry. That was my story. A father who gave everything, only to be told he was nothing, and who finally left behind a message that couldn't be ignored. If you've ever felt unappreciated, if you've ever given your all only to be overlooked, then maybe you understand a piece of what I went through. And if you're on the other side of that, if someone in your life has sacrificed for you, don't wait until it's too late to show them gratitude. Respect and love don't cost a thing, but they mean everything. I shared this story not just for myself, but for anyone who has carried the quiet burden of being taken for granted. My hope is that it makes you think about the people who've stood by you, the ones who worked in the shadows so you could stand in the light. Now, if this story moved you, even a little, I'd love for you to do 3 simple things. 1. Like this video so it reaches more people who might need to hear it. 2. Share it with someone you care about, maybe as a reminder of how much they mean to you. 3. Leave a comment down below. Tell me, what's the most powerful lesson you've learned about family, sacrifice, or respect? I read every single one, and your stories matter. 4. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Every week, I share powerful, real, human stories that will make you think, feel, and maybe even see your own life differently. Thanks for watching. And remember, never treat the people who gave you everything as extras in your story. They just might be the ones writing the ending.